I'm now going to be the poster boy for Duncan. Just ignore the arm, okay? So, Duncan Clark is a writer, a consultant editor on the Guardian Environment Desk, co-founder of digital journalism company called Kiln, and an honorary research associate here at the UCL-Energy Institute. He helped establish environmental charities such as Cool Earth and 1010, and has written and edited many books, including this one. Right, so tonight, Duncan and Mike, and unfortunately Mike Berners-Lee can't be with us. Unfortunately, his daughter's rather ill. So unfortunately, Duncan is going to take on both roles, aren't you?
Indeed.
So yes, so we'll be here until 10 o'clock. Right, have written this fascinating book, which you can purchase for the price of?
A bargain price of £8.
£8, probably cheaper than Amazon. It was described by Al Gore as a fascinating, important, and highly recommended. Not sure that's a blessing or a curse, okay? Not the way things are going. However, the key thing is it points out that carbon emissions have been going up exponentially, and nothing seems to stop it, whatever we're doing. And actually what I'm looking forward to today is Duncan firstly showing us why that's true, and also then explaining if there's actually anything we can do about it. So I leave the oil, coal and gas challenge to you, Duncan.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to UCL for hosting. I'm going to try and boil down not quite the whole book, but the majority of this 200-page book into a 40-minute talk. So I'm going to apologise in advance for the number of graphs I'm going to show, but I guess being where I am in a university, that's not going to be too much of a problem. Very briefly, I won't talk about me because we've already had that. I want to talk a little bit about the book, what the book set out to do. Me and my co-author Mike, we felt that the debate around climate change was often very focused. It was focused on a national level, it was focused on a technology level. And there wasn't a great deal of zooming out and looking at the whole thing on a kind of global system level. And that's really what we're trying to do. And so this book is about taking a really arm's length, big picture look at the whole issue. The book, and indeed this talk, breaks down into 4 parts. So I'm going to ask, where are we at with climate change? Are we making any progress? Secondly, in the context of that, what solutions do and don't work? I'm going to then ask, what are the barriers to the action that we need? And finally, I'm going to ask, what does that mean for what we should do? And at risk of repeating myself, because I'm going to come back to both these points, I just want to really hammer home these 2 big ideas which have really kind of run through the book. And the first one is that there is far, far more fossil fuel in the ground than we can safely burn. Now, this isn't a new realization. You know, James Hansen pointed this out in a paper best part of a decade ago. But it's a point that's only really now coming to the forefront of people's minds in terms of understanding the politics and economics of climate change. Secondly, many of the solutions we think should help don't necessarily work, at least not in the way that we tend to assume. So those are the kind of ideas I really want to explore in this talk. Now, the nature of climate change and where we're at with it, you've probably got a sense from the questions that I was asking that it's not all going to be good news. You may find yourself feeling a little bit like this during the talk. But really the idea is that if we can understand the issue properly and we can understand it in a big picture way, then we'll be much better equipped to actually have a go at solving it, and we'll be as happy as this little baby. So how are we doing solving climate change? I'm speaking to people in a university, so you won't be scared of words like exponential. I'm sure for many people, certainly any mathematicians or physicists in the room, will be able to just look at that shape and know that it's an exponential curve. But it's worth pausing to ask, what is an exponential curve? It's a curve that you get when you have a steady rate of acceleration, something that goes faster and faster and faster. Some examples: if you spend £10 on a credit card, you don't pay the debt, then the interest gets applied to the interest. You get a feedback loop, that creates the acceleration, and off you go, until eventually you go bankrupt. Or take algae in a jar. You put algae in a jar with enough air and enough food, and they will reproduce. The more there are, the faster they can breed, so the faster the population grows. So this is the signature shape of a feedback loop. Now, total carbon emissions since 1850. This is including not just the oil, coal and gas, but also the land use change, deforestation emissions. Now, some academics at Lancaster University last year published a paper that went largely unnoticed, but they just pointed out that if you take this graph and you overlay an exponential on it, something very striking comes into view, which is that human carbon emissions going back a century and a half follow an uncannily close resemblance to an exponential curve. Now, one thing that tells us straight away is that given that an exponential curve is, by its nature, the curve that you get when you have a feedback loop, this tells us there are some important feedback loops in the way that humans interact with their environment, and especially around energy use. The second thing it tells us, when you zoom right in the last 10 years, this is the same graph. And this is a really interesting point. That if you look at the last 10 years, so remember that the first IPCC assessment came out in about 1991. We've had Kyoto was negotiated in 97, came into force in the early 2000s. Looking at the last 10 years, how much deviation have we had from that long-term curve? The answer, precisely 0. In fact, since the book was published, there was the IEA released some data the other day which suggests that last year we might be a little bit under. But as you can see, we've gone up and under for years. So in terms of the big picture assessment, no deviation. Now, what does this mean? So one thing it suggests is that somehow this curve is kind of self-reinforcing, and I'm going to talk much more about why that might be the case. The things that we think might be helpful haven't slowed it down. So let's just pause for a moment to just think of what that implies. So what happens if we stay on this curve? If it keeps growing at 1.8% a year, which is the total sum of fossil fuels and deforestation? Well, of course, the answer depends on climate sensitivity and various other things which we don't understand perfectly well, but it seems highly likely that a lower end estimate of where we'd get to if we stay on this curve for another century is 4 degrees Celsius. And that's a conservative estimate. Now, it's worth pausing for a moment to ask what 4 Celsius means. So that's the equivalent of the temperature change that we've seen on the Earth since the last glacial... Oh, I've written minimum. That should be maximum. That's the danger of doing slides too quickly. The last glacial maximum, when there were ice sheets over much of the northern hemisphere, as thick as the 10 tallest buildings in the world stacked on top of each other. We're talking about a planet that looks fundamentally different. That's the level of temperature change we're talking about between the Industrial Revolution and where we're heading. So, as most people in this room will know, the world has said, well, we don't want to do anything quite that insane, so why don't we try and limit the temperature rise to 2 degrees C? This is certainly far more sensible than limiting it to 4 degrees. But if you trace back where that came from, that number which was originally advocated by the EU, is based on science largely from the 1990s. 2009, a paper was published which said, well, let's compare what the science says now compared to what the science said before, around 2 degrees C. Now, this is where we are at the moment, so ignore the numbers up the side, because actually that's 2 degrees is about here. So back when this target was starting to evolve and to form a consensus around it, it seemed like the scariest sort of change, the ones which scientists often refer to by the very prosaic name of large-scale discontinuity, otherwise known as runaway global warming, it seems pretty safe. We're in the white there. Now, 10 years on, we hit 2 degrees, we're firmly in the orange. Now, all of this science is evolving, it's complicated, and the error bars are large. But what's fairly clear is that we've been moving in a direction where 2 degrees looks more scary rather than more reassuring. But nonetheless, we've got a target. That's what we're aiming for. So what does it mean in practice? Well, one thing that science is actually very clear about is that the thing that determines the overall temperature rise that the world will experience is not, how much we emit in 2030 relative to 2010 or whatever. It's a very simple metric. It's how much carbon we emit in the rest of time, essentially. Now, this is the total amount of CO2 we've released in history. And that includes the deforestation and the fossil fuels, the black blob, 2,000 billion tons. Now, how much can we release if we want to stay within that 2 degree target? And the answer is depends on how lucky we're feeling. We've broken it here into two. This is a 50% chance of not exceeding 2 degrees. So 50% chance of failure, to put it in the negative. This is a 25% chance of failure, 75% chance of success. So that's what the world's remaining carbon budget looks like if we are serious about not exceeding 2 degrees. Now, there's been some evolution in the science in the last few years around climate sensitivity, which, if as some people believe, the climate turns out to be a little bit less sensitive to CO2 than we previously thought, these budgets would grow a bit. But we're not talking about a major change, and we're not sure that that change is going to happen at all. Now, just going back to the exponential curve, and now putting that in the context of these budgets, what would the curve, what needs to happen to that 150-year-old feedback loop in order to avoid more than 2 degrees rise? Well, this is what it looks like if you want a 75% chance of success. I've shown this graph to a few people, and they've turned around and said, well, hold on, that can't be right. This is surely more than a third of the area on the left or whatever. But this is, I've double-checked this many times, this is what it looks like. And I think that's, of course, the steepness depends on just how tall you make the graph, but no matter how you draw it, what is very clear is that for a 75% chance of success, you're looking at turning around a 150-year-old feedback system with a really terrifying rate, resulting in a completely improbable kind of alpine peak on the top of that graph. So you might say, well, that's never going to happen. And I personally would say, you're right, that's never going to happen. So how about if we said 50-50 odds? I mean, we're now into the realms where we might be getting to the point where it's slightly difficult to explain to our children why we took these odds. But let's say we take them. And instead of having a sudden turnaround, let's leave ourselves till 2020 to peak global emissions. We're still talking about an extraordinary roller coaster of a graph that requires a very, very long-term trend to be turned on its head. So, that's the bad news. But maybe there's some good news. Maybe the fossil fuels that are causing the bulk of these emissions could become a constraint. I mean, a lot of green thinking is about hitting resource constraints. Well, is that true? How much longer could the fossil fuel in the ground support that curve? Well, we crunched the numbers and we found that probably if you really stayed on that rate of growth that we've had for 150 years, you could probably keep going for about a century or so with the fuel that's underground. So there is a constraint. Unfortunately, it's not a constraint that will kick in anywhere near fast enough for us to remain within the budgets we need to remain within. So here's a graph that puts that really in perspective. The coin flip and the double coin flip budgets from before, 50 and 75% chance of success, compared to the carbon dioxide that would be released if we burnt the world's proven oil, coal and gas reserves. Now in this audience, many people will know that proven reserves means something very specific. It means the reserves which the companies that own them assume with a 90% degree of likelihood will be extracted and burnt. The definition varies a little bit around the world. But even with this proven reserves only, it's very clear that we're talking about burning perhaps a third to a quarter of it if we want a really good chance of success, and maybe half of it if we're feeling a little bit more lucky. However, that is only the proven reserves. Now, anyone who follows energy at all will have seen the shale oil, the shale gas, the tar sands, all these new forms of energy coming on stream. So just to put this in context, I'm not saying that for a minute all these will ever be sort of plausibly extracted, but if you take the technically recoverable fuel in the world and stack it up like this, and you compare that to the budgets I was talking about before, it becomes clear that the constraint is not with the fossil fuels. Even if you take off all that coal, because you might say a lot of it is just never going to be economically viable, and you just look at the oil and gas, which the world is making such an effort to open up as fast as possible at the moment, it's still clear that we are way exceeding our budgets. So if the constraint isn't going to do it, maybe global politics is going to come to the rescue. Well, how's the global climate talks doing? So the business as usual line here, this is from Carbon Action Tracker, Climate Action Tracker. Some of you may know their work. They basically track the global talks and try and work out what they mean in terms of carbon emissions. Now, a few things about this graph. The first thing is they haven't continued the exponential curve up. So they just started at 1990 and they said, what do we think the future of energy use looks like? Well, I would say that if you put it in the context of 150 years of a clear trend, actually that should be going up much more steeply. Second point, the current pledges, and this is where I completely agree with the graph, are completely and utterly insufficient to get anywhere close to the 2-degree target we need. The third point I'd make is that even that is perhaps a little bit optimistic, because the current pledges are based on the assumption that if a carbon saving is made in one country, then that will not in any way bounce back in another country. And as I'm going to talk about later on, I think actually there's very strong evidence to suggest that that isn't true. So this is making the point that we're nowhere near it at the global politics level, and unfortunately the analysis is in itself probably a bit too optimistic. So with all that in mind, what solutions are going to be helpful and what aren't in turning around that exponential system? Well, I'm going to just quickly dive into 4 components which combine together to add up to the total amount of CO2 which we emit. Some of you may have looked at this kind of analysis before, something called the Gore analysis. And it's based on the simple idea that one of many ways in which you could break up carbon emissions is to say there are a certain number of people. Each of those people has a certain level of income. Each unit of income requires a certain amount of energy, and each unit of energy requires a certain amount of carbon to be emitted. So let's just look at how those trends have played out over the last half century or so and see what that tells us about what solutions are going to be helpful. Well, population, this one's interesting. In 1960, the average woman in the world had 5 children. Today that is now down to about 2.5. So the rate of population growth, although the total population is still going up, the rate of growth has fallen like a stone over those 50 years. Interestingly, that's had no impact on the exponential emissions growth. Now, when you pause and think about it, actually, perhaps that's not so surprising. When do populations stop growing so fast? They stop growing so fast largely when they get richer. What happens when people get richer? They tend to increase their energy use. The two are very closely bound up. So perhaps it's not surprising that this is one example of what we talk about in the book as a balloon squeezing effect, where something that you think will be you think is going to make a difference, actually, instead of, might be a squeeze over here, but it results in a bulge over there. Affluence, or economic growth. Now this one does coincide very closely with the carbon emissions. They've gone up in lockstep pretty well since the beginning of time. And that's not surprising. I mean, the things that drive economic growth, things like labour productivity, are closely related to our use of energy. Energy powers the machines that allows each worker to produce more goods, etc. However, in terms of what solutions are going to help, this one isn't so clear. I mean, there are people who argue the way to solve climate change is to aim for a steady state economy. People like Tim Jackson. Now that's an interesting thought experiment, but immediately runs up against all sorts of problems. So firstly, how can that ever be made to work politically? How do you persuade the world to vote for a world in which affluence levels off or even declines in the rich world? Secondly, it's not necessarily going to be sufficient. People like Tim Jackson say, well, we should level off growth in the rich world. Well, the rich world now accounts for only about 35% of the world's total carbon emissions, and still less than half of the world's total carbon footprint, even when you account for all the imported goods. So you can't be only doing this in the rich world if you want to make the difference. That's not to say that that line of thinking doesn't have an important point to make, because, as I'll talk about later on, our kind of thirst for growth is unquestionably something that's closely bound up with why we're struggling to solve the problem. But again, this as a kind of solution isn't looking very promising. Efficiency. This one's more gets closer to the heart of the debate as we see it in the energy world. So couldn't we just make everything more energy efficient, and wouldn't that mean that we use less energy? Now, the problem with that argument, although it's very attractive in principle, is that if you look at the last 50 years, it's very clear that we have been making everything more efficient. We've had steadily increasing energy efficiency for at least 50 years, and there's a couple of papers that suggest that really goes right back to the beginning of time. I mean, you take the standard example is the light bulb. We used to have candles, we then had tungsten bulbs, we then had compact fluorescent bulbs, we then had LED bulbs. In each stage, we are able to produce the same amount of light with less energy. The problem is that that allows us to produce more light bulbs and use more of them. Now this gets to where the debate that's normally called the rebound effect. But in the book, we wanted to explore how can it be, after 50 years, or 100 years, or 150 years of increasing energy efficiency gains, how can it be that that's made apparently zero difference to that long-term curve? And so we thought, okay, let's try and pick this apart a bit. And we came up with this diagram. So let's think of the case study in which everyone in the UK gets a more efficient car. Now, the traditional discussion of the rebound effect is really little more than saying, if people get a new car, will they drive a bit more because it's cheaper? Now, that's only one level of rebound effect. So that's the one up here. If people get more efficient cars, either there's only two logical possibilities: they'll either drive them more because it's cheaper, or they're going to use less fuel and save some money. Now, of course, if you did that across the whole of a society, you're going to see somewhere between the two. You're going to be getting a bit of both. But what actually happens when you follow that chain down. Well, if some people do drive more, that doesn't only offset some of the gains, that tends to increase the demand for roads. It means that that car will need to be replaced sooner because it's driven further. It means that, getting to the really subtle ripple effects, it means that it's more plausible to have a world in which suburban houses are attractive, which certainly in the US especially is actually a huge factor in why we're struggling with this at a global level politically. And of course, if you have suburban homes, they're bigger, they take more energy to heat. So all these subtle rebound effects, which are basically impossible to measure, but you can plausibly see how that will play out. But let's assume that some people do drive less and they save some money. Well, one thing that's going to happen is that that money has to be spent on something. There's no way around that. If you just leave it in a bank, they'll spend it on your behalf by loaning it to someone else. It will get spent. Everything we spend money on has an energy footprint. Again, we've offset some more of the gains. But not just that. If you use less fuel, then it's pretty obvious that you're going to have a microscopically small, but not insignificant, not irrelevant, effect on the global oil price. If the whole of the UK suddenly stopped importing oil, oil would become cheaper, and some of the gains, impossible to say how many, but some of the gains would be lost by more people being able to afford oil in other countries. You put all that together and it becomes easy to see how actually the efficiency gains that we've had over hundreds of years are closely bound up with that exponential growth. So what about the final approach, which usually gets advocated? Carbon intensity, the amount of carbon that we produce from each unit of energy. Can we lower that? And the obvious way to do it is by building more clean energy capacity. Now this graph, again, I think is interesting. What it shows is that since about 1960, the level of carbon that we produce from each unit of energy has actually been more or less flat when you look at it globally. It was falling very slightly throughout the second half of the 20th century, but since around 2000, if anything, it's been creeping back up. Ignore the blip there, I think that's just a blip in the data. But how can that be? We've got organisations like UCL working on clean energy systems. We've all seen more wind turbines and solar panels going up, not just in the UK, but we read about it in China and other countries as well. Well, the answer is because clean energy systems don't in themselves mean that we don't burn fossil fuel. It's an assumption that's often made, but it isn't actually that obvious. This graph shows the total energy capacity added to the world's energy systems in the last 10 years. So this is the net change rather than the total. And what it shows is that we did pretty well. We did 500 million tons of oil equivalent in renewables in the last 10 years. That's not bad, but it's been absolutely outpaced by the growth in coal, oil, and gas. Now at first you might think, well, why would that happen? And I think this graph starts to give a sense of, well, it starts to give an answer. And it comes back to that idea of feedback loop. So it's usually assumed that when we get a better, cheaper, cleaner energy system, that we're just going to scrap the others. And there are some examples of that. We don't burn whale oil anymore. But actually, if you look at the global perspective, 1850 we almost entirely survived with wood as our energy source. As coal started to ramp up, did it displace biomass? No. In fact, biomass increased a little bit. Why would that be? Because, of course, with more economic activity, more technology development, we're able to use more wood. And then we discover oil. Oil is cleaner than coal. It's more transportable than coal. It's in every way a superior energy source to coal. So as oil scaled up, does that mean we use less coal? Of course not. It means we use more coal. Because apart from anything else, what do we run our coal mines with? Each energy source we bring on stream makes it possible to access the other ones better. And then maybe the middle half of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, we start getting into the cleaner energy sources. Gas starts to come on stream. Hydro, nuclear, and invisible on this graph, sadly, solar and wind. But it's often assumed that each bit of energy that we've created from those clean sources must have reduced the amount of dirty energy we use. But when you look at this graph and you think of it in a system level, that isn't by any means obvious. And in fact, if you think of the technological change that's been enabled by these extra energy sources, things like the microchip and the internet, computer development, those are the technologies that have ended up being incredibly useful for extracting the harder to reach oil, coal and gas. So really, it's a case of a feedback loop in which energy, left to its own devices, but gets energy. So population doesn't look that promising as a means to solving it, might have a role. Efficiency in itself isn't going to reduce the amount of fossil fuel we use necessarily. Clean energy sources might not have the effect that we think of, that we usually assume. And the more socio-economic approaches, such as levelling off economic growth, might not work either. All of which sounds pretty stark and negative. But really, it's a very long way of getting to the simple point. We've got more fuel than we can burn. And if we don't want to burn it, we have to decide not to burn it. This is where I'm going to show some extremely fancy graphics. It's such an obvious thing to say that I'm almost embarrassed to say it. But climate change really does boil down to this. We've got this incredibly valuable, incredibly useful energy source buried in the ground all over the world, and if we don't want to destroy the planet over the next century, we have to decide not to use it. So, why is that so hard? What are the barriers to reducing fossil fuel use? I mean, we all know that there are various mechanisms that have been proposed. We can just put a tax on carbon. We can cap the carbon and trade the permits. Some people even propose we could have a mandatory sequestration where we forget all environmental regulation for climate change and we simply say that anyone who takes carbon out of the ground has an obligation to put some back in. There are various things that could work, but they're not being introduced. Why? The middle section of our book looks at this, and we try to unpick a few of the details in order to understand the barriers that need to be overcome. The first one is the most obvious, the value of the reserves and the infrastructure required to burn those reserves. How much is the world's fossil fuel worth? And we go into this at a little bit of length in the book. The answer is no one can meaningfully say it because it depends on all sorts of factors such as discount rates, it depends on things such as how quickly you think other energy sources will become cost comparable. But certainly if you were to paint a broad brush picture, you're talking about the tens of trillions of dollars. You're talking about something immensely valuable. Now if you start to think about how that plays out in the global climate talks, this starts to unpick a little bit of what the barriers to action have been. This shows the carbon under the ground in each of the world's countries grouped by continent. The nations pushing hardest for a global deal in the trade talk, in the climate talks are the Europe, Africa, and the small island states. Now, usually people just assume there are kind of historical reasons why that must be the case. But another way to look at it is that they own only about 5% of the world's fossil fuel. And I think the UK is an interesting example of this. Why did we have world-leading climate legislation 5 years ago? Well, you might say because we've got good campaigners and because we're a good progressive people in the UK. Another way to look at it would be, if you look at the BP statistical reserve data, 5 years of oil, 7 years of gas, 12 years of coal. We don't have anything to lose. Switch to the rest, and interestingly, if you look at what's happened in the last few years, we've started to discover shale gas in the UK. It's not a coincidence that the discovery of that reserve has gone hand in hand with the recalcitrance in the current government in pushing harder on climate legislation. Look at the rest of the world. I could probably have done this graph better, because in fact the rest of the world, almost all of that stack, comes down to 6 countries and regions. US, Canada, China, India, Russia, and the Middle East. They are the countries and the regions that own the world's carbon. They don't want to leave it in the ground, and they are the ones that have been overwhelmingly unhelpful in the talks so far. But it's not only those countries, because we also, the UK has something like 15% of the world's carbon that's in listed companies listed on its stock market. And what are those companies, many of which based here in London, what are they doing? Even though they know that we have at least twice as much fuel, too much fuel than we can burn, and possibly as much as 10 or 20 times. Well, they're spending the best part of $1 trillion developing new reserves. And they're doing this with money that belongs to everyone. This is pension fund money, this is insurance money, this is investment and savings and investments. This is a kind of form, I think, of kind of cognitive dissonance, really. But however you see it, what's interesting is that the energy companies are basically gambling on the assumption that we will fail to solve climate change. So let's put that first barrier to action aside and move on to the second one, economic growth. I don't have time to talk about this in depth, but the simple question which comes up a lot and rarely has an intelligent answer in my experience is, could it be done? Could we solve climate change and keep the economy growing? And Mike and I explore this in the book, and we come to the conclusion again that the honest answer is nobody has a clue. The number of factors involved are absolutely vast. It depends on everything from the future price of carbon capture technology through to whether or not people in the UK will ever embrace onshore wind. It's the cheapest renewable energy source we have, but people hate it. Nuclear the same. So whether or not we can keep the economy growing while we solve climate change depends not just on how sensitive the economy turns out to be proved to energy, which is another thing we don't know about, but it depends on socio and economic factors such as our views on these different energy sources. But it's interesting to just pick up briefly on one effort to move beyond the growth paradigm, because whether or not it's possible, one thing that's clear is that if all we seek to do is grow the economy, then it's pretty unlikely we're ever going to say, I know, let's leave all that fuel in the ground, because that fuel is useful for economic growth. However much alternative energy you have, you could burn the fuels in the ground and get yet more economic growth. So David Cameron, interesting example, this is just before the shale gas revolution I mentioned before. So he said, you know, we need to be a bit more grown up about this. We've all been glued to GDP as the metric forever. Why don't we start measuring our well-being in a more holistic and way that, you know, thinks about things like how happy we are. Very sensible. The second, that things are not going the way he wants economically, everything turns around. In the book, we've noticed that in 1 week after, and this is the same week in which his growth, alternative metric to growth statistics came out, the Office of National Statistics published their wellbeing stats. In that same week, David Cameron allowed his finance minister to call on OPEC to increase the amount of oil that they produce. So, going back to that problem of the feedback loop, calling on other countries to produce more fossil fuels is not the right way to reduce global emissions. He also announced that he wants every department to be a growth department, making it absolutely clear where his political priorities were. And just to really drill the point home, he showed that that applied to the transport department by firing the minister in a reshuffle and appointing someone who he knew wouldn't stand in the way of a new runway at Heathrow, specifically for the reason of economic growth. Now I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to race through some of the last slides. Barrier to action number 3, social and psychological factors. And this was an area which I had never really looked at very much before. I found it absolutely fascinating to delve a little bit into the psychological literature and to try and make sense of what is it about us as a species that allows us to have that 150-year exponential curve pointing very clearly to global disaster, and for us all just be getting on with things. And this applies whether, you know, we're talking about energy researchers through to people who just aren't interested in climate change at all. Somehow, something's stopping us getting a handle on the big picture. And we picked through lots of literature and picked out a few things which we think are relevant. One example, optimism bias. There's a very clearly observed tendency across human society that if you give people an uncertain future and you say, how are things going to turn out, then people are irrationally optimistic about the future. And this can be measured by asking people, what's your chance of living to a ripe old age? Almost everyone thinks they're going to live longer than average. Now, it doesn't take a mathematician to spot that that's a problem. Almost everyone thinks they've got a higher than average chance of winning the lottery, which is how we fund the arts in the UK. And almost everyone thinks that one way or another, someone else will step into the breach and solve a problem. And I think that one's particularly interesting for climate change, because if you survey people and you say, whose job is it to solve climate change? They all say, oh, well, the government will sort it out, and companies. You speak to government and companies with a kind of campaigning hat on, and they say, well, we'd love to do more on climate change, but people aren't demanding it. So that kind of optimism bias plays into that unhelpful loop. There's a now bias. We're kind of almost evolutionarily stuck to the present. And Richard Dawkins makes the argument that sustainability is about long-term foresight, and long-term foresight is something we are not equipped with. Now, even he acknowledges that there's some wiggle room on that, and that we're perfectly able, in his words, to override our kind of base impulses. But it's a problem. We're not very good at thinking 2 or 3 decades out ahead, certainly not 2 or 3 centuries. I'm going to skip the rest just to try and make sure I get to the end of the slides. The fourth barrier. How do you share things out? Now, I just want to propose looking at the global climate talks a slightly different way. We normally think about who cuts what. I think that the easier way to understand it, and the way that really gets to the real politics, is if you said, well, we can only burn a quarter of the remaining fossil fuel reserves. You imagine those being put in the centre of a circle of diplomats. The purpose of those talks, really, if they were ever going to function properly, is to decide who gets what slice of that slice. And when you think of it in those stark terms, you really think of it as sharing out what we are artificially inducing as a scarcity on one of the most precious and valuable resources known, then it's pretty obvious that that is an incredibly difficult diplomatic thing to crack. And lots of people sort of take a policy view on this. They say, oh, if we just had a carbon tax, then that would do it. If we just had cap and trade, or if we just had mandatory sequestration. And the point we get to in the book is that no matter what system you're using on a policy level, there's always a reason why some country or region is going to feel that they're getting a bad deal. Whether that's the developing world because of a historical responsibility, whether that's the countries that have the oil, coal and gas that are going to have to be written off. If all countries try and get the best possible deal, then we're going to remain with the inertia that we've had so far. So that's the situation, the possible solutions, the barriers to action. What does that tell us about what we should do? Now, I've only got 5 minutes left, and I've deliberately kept this one to one slide anyway, because I wanted this to be the subject of the discussion. But these are the 5 broad categories we brought it down to in the book. The first one might sound a bit broad and hippie-ish almost to an academic audience. But we think that the thing that really needs to happen is people need to care more about climate change. Because no matter what policies you invent, no matter what technologies you invent, they're not going to be implemented at anything like the rate required until more people care about this problem. And that has all sorts of implications for how we think about climate change, how we message it as people who work in the area. So, I mean, more specifically, what Mike and I have got to in our thinking is the belief that the whole way of thinking, the whole way of messaging climate change that tries to pose it as something which is a kind of something that goes very naturally and comfortably with economic growth is simply problematic, because it fails to get to the core of the problem, which is that we are about to do something very dangerous with the planet. Unless we care about it enough, we will not leave those fuels in the ground. So we've got to move away from a model of saying, oh, well, you know, we can all ride a bike a bit more and it'll make us healthy, because that will not be enough to solve the problem. Capping the carbon. Now this is I could talk for an hour and a half just about this one. I mean, we came to the conclusion that we think a hard cap is the only way that you can really ever stay within a budget. Although we are interested in the idea of mandatory sequestration, where you have an ever-rising requirement on people taking fossil fuel out of the ground to put it back in. It's another way to do the same thing. But what does that one mean in practice? How do you actually take on the fossil fuel industry, which has done a great deal over the last 20 years, to stand in the way of those caps? In the US, for example, almost $1 billion a year is spent by the energy industries in lobbying and political donations alone. This is a massive issue. The American political world is swimming in fossil fuel money. And until that is something that is widely recognised and understood, then we're not going to be able to make much progress. But in the UK, it's not quite so bad. We have a little bit of that. But there's all sorts of other ways in which the fossil fuel industries have their kind of influence in ways that may be more subtle. I'd like to raise one. I got an email from a UCL academic who pointed out to me that, did I know that the Institute for Sustainable Resources was funded by a grant from BHP Billiton, the coal company, which is something I didn't know. And I thought there was a wonderful irony in coming to give a talk which partly was about facing the reality of these vested interests, only to realise that my talk is being sponsored by a coal company. I then Googled BHP Billiton and I found that in 2009 they were one of the coal companies who were caught red-handed sponsoring a lobbying firm who was sending fake letters to the American government in order to try and make it less likely that there would be any carbon tax pre-Copenhagen. Very significant, very influential, and very interesting. What should the UCL-Energy Institute be doing about it? I think that's a very interesting question, and one I wouldn't be at all surprised if it comes up in the talk afterwards. But certainly, how we as a world interact with the fossil fuel industries is something we need to think very hard about if those industries continue doing what they've been doing so far, which is expanding their reserve, even though they know there's more fuel than we've got, and lobbying against progress. Now, this doesn't apply to every fossil fuel company, but it applies to enough for this to be a key area that's too often ignored. Technologies. Of course we need more technologies. Of course we need a huge effort to have the third industrial revolution, as some people call it. But when you think of it as a system level, as I was talking about before, it's obvious that the technologies in themselves will not necessarily take us off that curve. So what we need to do is use technologies and efficiency as enablers to reduce fossil fuels. If we want to cap carbon, if we want to tax carbon, if we want to directly regulate carbon, we need to be doing that while we scale up the other technologies. Otherwise, there's a very real risk that we simply won't cut emissions the way that we hope. And this applies to all the technologies. So, for example, the nuclear debate has been so prominent among Greens recently. I mean, I personally have a view on the nuclear debate, but my main view on it is this. It's the wrong debate. The debate is, should we be slowing the rate at which we take fossil fuels out of the ground? And the answer is, if we want to reduce emissions, yes. What will then fill that void is an interesting question, and nuclear may or may not be part of it. Personally, I think it will. But nuclear in itself does not write off oil, coal, and gas. I've only got a couple of minutes left, so just very quickly on these last two bullets. What about all the non-carbon emissions, the non-CO2 emissions? So we're talking here about soot, about methane, about HFCs and all these other gases. And we went back and forward on this and found that what was really interesting, with the exception of nitrous oxide, the fast-acting gases can do an extraordinary amount, if you get on top of them, to bring down temperatures, or at least hold down the temperature rise over the next half century. They can do far more than CO2. But the sting in the tail is that all you do, because the CO2 continues to accumulate, is you push the temperature peak further away. You don't actually reduce it. So it's absolutely crucial, given how close we might be to global tipping points, to be working really hard on those other gases. But we need to be doing it hand in hand with CO2. We can't be doing it as an excuse for not dealing with the fossil fuels. Land, I think, is something which has its own, another area we could talk about for hours. But one thing that particularly jumped out for me researching the book was this idea of soil carbon. What can the world's farm systems do to increase the amount of take-up from carbon in the air? And the answer, I think, is a lot, potentially a lot at least. It's an area that's been almost entirely underfunded, but one which, personally, I think deserves a lot more attention. And so, finally, leadership. Now, that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and there's a chance that it might sound just a little bit vague and wishy-washy. Of course we need leadership. But what does leadership look like? What it boils down to is that every person is in a different position to do different things. And the default argument that, oh, you know, everyone can just switch off their phone chargers or write their MP or whatever it is not necessarily going to work. Each person has different buttons that they can push. I went to a really interesting talk recently by the guy who made Chasing Ice, the documentary that showed all those incredible ice collapses in the Arctic. And someone asked the question at the end, what can I do about this? And he said, I don't know, I'm a filmmaker, I made a film. And I thought that was a good answer, because it gets to if you work in the fossil fuel industry, you can probably do a lot more than anyone else by just having some hard conversations with the parts of your organisation which do lobbying, for example. But if you're just a family, you can work to cut your carbon. Yes, the rebound effect might mean that that's going to get cancelled out at the global level, but it will still have social ripple effects. If you're a politically engaged person, then it could be that the best thing for you to do is not worry about the precise number of grams of your carbon footprint, but just to try and discuss some of this stuff with people in power. And Mike and I made our own little personal effort on that on the last week, when I had the slightly disappointingly tedious task of stuffing 1,500 copies of our own book into envelopes in order to send them to all MPs and lords. And we get to find out if any of them are going to read it, but you can but try. Anyway, so that is the end of my talk. I want to leave with one final thought, which is how we put it in the book. The climate, the reason the climate is so interesting and so dangerous and so hard to grapple with psychologically and socially is because it's a complex system. It's a system that is capable, and we know this from history, of tipping from one state to another. Now, at the moment, what's really clear is that we are nowhere near having a human response of the scale required to stop the chance of that climate tipping. But human society also is a complex system. It's a system in which 7 billion people interact with each other in ways far too subtle and numerous to ever fully understand. The question for this century, really, is what's going to tip first? Is it going to be the climate, or is it going to be the human response to that climate change? And this is really where the leadership comes in. Anyone pushing roughly in the right direction, even if their efforts seem to be completely pointless, must surely be pushing human society towards some kind of tipping point. And that's really all we can hope for, because the rate of turnaround required is truly vast.